Thank you. All right, so I'm here today to discuss the Continuous Process Improvement Program, which is also referred to as CPI. My name is Jenna Cohn, and I'm a clinical data analyst that runs our CPI program. So in this session, we'll review the requirements each center must meet in order to be considered in good standing for CPI, and then we'll wrap up with an overview of the CPI report. We'll be using Poll Everywhere website for knowledge check questions throughout the presentations. In a separate browser, you can use the link on the slide to open the website, or you can scan the QR code here with your mobile device and use that for answering the questions. So it looks like they went ahead and put the link in the chat for you to click, and you can go to that link. And I'll keep this slide open for you guys to navigate to that address. All right, so the CPI program assures timely and accurate submission of data to support the many deliverables that use CIBMTR data to promote collaborative research that increases access and improves outcomes of all cell therapies. CPI also supports our ability to perform benchmarking and to provide accurate population-level data to HRSA. CPI is assessed in trimesters, which means 3 times a year. Those trimesters are different for US versus international centers. These dates are also posted in the data management guide and also in FormsNet, so you get to know these dates very well if you don't already. At the end of each trimester, CIBMTR assesses how well each center performed against the target metrics and requirements. For centers that have met all requirements, they will receive a status of good standing at the end of the trimester. We do have an exemption process in place, and I'll talk more on that a bit later. If a center is unable to meet all the targets, the center will drop in standing to first warning. If the center is able to meet all the requirements the next trimester, they will return to good standing. If the center misses any of the targets for a second consecutive trimester, they will drop then to probation. Again, centers can return to good standing by meeting all of the targets the next trimester. If the center missed the targets for the 3rd consecutive trimester, they will drop to suspension. At this point, this standing may impact access into CIBMTR studies or reporting commitment levels. All right, for our first Poll Everywhere question, what is the purpose of CPI? Is it A, to support deliverables that promotes collaborative research, B, assures accurate and timely data submission, C, increases access and improves outcomes of all cell therapies, or D, all of the above?
All right, Jenna, it looks like our answers have rolled in with most people selecting D, all of the above.
Wonderful, great job, guys. And the answer is D, which is all the above. So good job. All right, Poll Everywhere quiz question number 2. CPI is assessed on a what timeline? A, quarterly, B, trimester, C, yearly, or D, weekly?
With our answers coming in, we have seen that most participants selected B, trimester.
which is the correct answer. So great job to everybody. All right, moving on. So there are 3 standards for CPI, each of which have a few requirements, and we'll go through each of them in detail. The first standard has to do with documentation. So the first requirement has to do with ensuring CIBMTR has current documentation for data sharing and informed consent. The DTA and MHA are usually taken care of as part of the initial setup of the center, but may also need to be updated if there is significant change in regulations or center structure. Local IRB approval of informed consent documents need to be renewed annually. If your center is using NMDP's IRB, this is handled for you, and you don't have to take any action to meet this requirement. If you are not using NMDP's IRB, you will need to send updated documentation each year. Your CPI reports provide the date your current IRB documents expire. You'll need to get the documents reapproved before the expiration date to ensure that your site does not have a lapse in approval. Do not consent patients with an expired consent form. You may need to check in with your site's IRB specialist to ensure that these documents are forwarded to CIBMTR. The database team will be in contact several weeks before the expiration to remind you that this is pending. In order to meet CPI, CIBMTR needs to receive these documents by the end of the trimester in which your IRB expires. If a lapse in approval occurs, there may be additional requirements needed to meet CPI. I've included in this slide with several additional resources for IRB topics. I highly recommend reviewing the recordings as it is a nice overview of consent. All right, quiz question number 3. True or false? If your IRB MHA status is expired, you will be able to pass CPI if all other categories are in good standing. A, true, or B, false.
Answers have come in, and we see that the majority of people have selected B, false.
Great job, and the answer is false. So again, you need to have an up-to-date IRB in order to pass CPI. All right, the second standard has to do with our consecutive transplant audit, also known as our CTA process. So the next standard, again, is the CTA process, and this is covered in detail next, so I won't spend a lot of time on it here. Essentially, it is the process used to ensure that all reportable transplants make it into FormSnet. There are multiple requirements. First, the center must submit a list of all their transplants that took place in the prior year. Then the CIBMTR will compare that list against FormSnet, and the centers must resolve any discrepancies between their list and FormSnet. Finally, CIBMTR does one last check to ensure all forms have the correct data and validations are rerun with regard to any updates that are made. All of these need to be complete in order to meet the CPI requirements. The third standard has to do with the form completion standard. Forms have been split into several categories. Each category has a specific target completion percentage, and all targets must be met in order to be in good standing for CPI. If you are ever not sure about which category a form is counted in or when it is due, you can always refer to our data management guide. CIBMTR acknowledges a site may have difficulty achieving CPI requirements in a given trimester due to extenuating circumstances such as staff shortages, turnover, or other unforeseen challenges. CIBMTR allows for 3 types of exemptions to the requirements. The first, a reduced target exemption, is the most common. Centers may request reduced targets for a single trimester to accommodate staffing issues or other concerns related to logistics, like a site move or an external event that impacts a center's operations for an extended period of time, such as a hurricane. Reduced targets are posted in the data management guide on the exemption page. The second is a more extensive and requires a meeting between CIBMTR leadership and center leadership to discuss resources, priorities, and milestones. During this call, we will formulate a custom exemption plan. Lastly, CIBMTR provides a near-miss exemption. An automatic exemption is granted if a CPI form completion target is missed by a single form or less than a 1% difference in one metric and all other criteria are met. Centers do not need to submit an exemption request for this exemption type. This exemption is granted after the final review of trimester standings by CIBMTR leadership. This automatic exemption may not be granted if any exemptions were granted during the previous trimester. Additional details can be found in our data management guide. All right, there are several dates that are assigned to each form in FormsNet. You can see these dates in the Forms Grid in FormsNet at any time. And I wanted to specifically call out a few of these, in part because some of the wording has developed around these dates has contributed to confusion, and in part because we made some changes to how these are used in CPI with our standards. So the earliest complete date is generally considered the first date that we'd expect to see data reported for a given form. For pre-transplant forms, this is always day 0, the infusion date. For post-transplant forms, this is usually the anniversary, day 100, or the 1-year anniversary, for example. The due date then is the date that CIBMTR would prefer to receive the data by. This date is based on the criticality of the form and the complexity of the form. All forms should be completed by the due date whenever possible, but it is not always practical, which is where the CPI program comes in. CPI is using the due date to determine when to hold centers accountable for completing forms. Most CPI requirements are looking at the forms with a due date in the previous trimester, meaning forms with a due date that occurred within the trimester prior. Critical forms have a requirement related to due dates in the current trimester, however, so it is important to understand the distinction between when a form is due and when it is expected for CPI. One other thing that I wanted to point out before we get into the detailed requirement is the dynamic nature of forms due in FormsNet. The way the system is structured, forms are added and removed based on what data are reported. So for example, you learned in the forms journey session that completing a 2814 will trigger the 2400 and 2402 or 4000 depending on the infusion type. Similarly, the 2400 or 2402 when complete will nearly always add several forms once the follow-up track has been determined. Reporting infections or new malignancies may add forms to capture the necessary details on those events, depending on the follow-up track assigned. It works both ways, of course. Reporting subsequent transplant or patient death will remove the extra forms that don't need to be completed. So for this reason, the actual number of forms required to meet your CPI metrics is subject to change up until the close of the trimester. Using FormsNet Center Forms Due Tool will always provide you a real-time list of what forms are expected. All right, so I mentioned critical forms earlier, so let's dive into those. Critical forms are exactly what they sound like. They capture data critical to support all other CPI activity, such as study enrollment, regulatory and quality assurance needs, as well as publicly available reports like CBDR and TCSA. They also trigger all the other forms that are due for CPI. As such, submitting these forms in a timely manner is very important. Critical forms include the following: the indication form, Form 2814, which captures the infusion type and date and triggers the 2400 and 2402 or the 4000, depending on whether the infusion was an HCT or cell therapy. The pre-TED form, which is the Form 2400, which captures the patient demographics, study enrollment, and donor information, and triggers the product and infusion forms based on the product reported. The pre-CTED form, the Form 4000, captures the patient demographics, study enrollment, product information, and triggers the product and infusion forms based on the products reported. The disease classification form, Form 2402, which captures the disease information and is used with the 2400 to determine the follow-up track and forms due. Lastly, the infusion form, Form 2006, which captures the critical sterility and cell counts used by cord banks and others to assess product quality and confirm infusion cell counts. Because these forms are so important, there are two separate requirements for critical forms. The first is that critical forms must be submitted before the form due date whenever possible. This metric looks at the percentage of forms with due dates in the current trimester that are completed by the due date. The final target for this one is 50% of the critical forms are completed by the form due date. The second requirement is that critical forms due in the previous trimester, those that didn't get completed by the due date, must be completed by the end of the current trimester. The final target for these past due critical forms is that 98% of them are completed. Study supplemental forms are those forms that come due based on study participation and are outside of the standard forms collected for an infusion. So this doesn't include all forms for patients enrolled on a study, but rather those additional forms, usually beginning with the 25 form number, that are due in addition to the standard forms. These forms are due for studies for which the center's medical director has committed to participation. Like critical forms, these forms are generally expected to be completed by the due date whenever possible. The CPI requirement then is focused on those that were not completed by the due date, ensuring that the rest of the forms are completed by the end of the next trimester. The target for this metric is 100% completion of all study supplemental forms that were due in the previous trimester. All forms not classified as critical or study supplemental are counted in this all other forms category. The final metric for this category is that 95% of forms due in the previous trimester must be completed. The last metric has to do with queries. While all the other metrics focus on the form due date, the query metric is using the date the query was placed, as queries can be placed at any time. Queries may be placed for missing or inconsistent data, or when clarification or documentation is needed to confirm the reported data, often with relation to a specific deliverable like CBDR, TCSA, or a study. In general, queries should be resolved within 6 weeks of placement whenever possible. Queries can be located in the FormsNet using My Work page, where there's a separate grid for queries, or by searching the center form due, or by viewing the weekly query report that is distributed. The final target for queries is that 95% of queries placed in the previous trimester must be resolved. All right, so that was a lot of information. And if you ever need a refresher on these requirements, all of this information is included in your data management guide. And of course, we send out weekly reports with your center's current status for each of these metrics, which we'll get to next after a couple quiz questions. All right, quiz question number 4. What are the 5 critical forms? Is it A, forms 2814, 2400, 2402, 2450, 2006, B, 2814, 2400, 4000, 2402, 2006, C, forms 2814, 2400, 4000, 2402, 2100, or D, forms 2400, 2402, 2006, 2100, 2450.
All right, Jenna, it looks like most of our participants have selected B, forms 2814, 2400, 4000, 2402, and 2006.
Yay, great job, guys. And B is the correct answer. All right, quiz question number 5. What form category is due by the form due date and not at the end of the trimester? Is it A, critical form, B, study supplemental form, C, all other forms, or D, queries?
All right, most of our respondents have selected A, critical forms.
Great job, everyone. And critical form is the correct answer. All right, and we'll be moving on into our CPI summary reports next. So first, the query reports are distributed separately from CPI reports as they contain information on all outstanding queries, not just those expected for CPI. So you can use the date the query placed column to determine which queries are being tracked for CPI. Each query will have a comment indicating what needs to be fixed. Read these comments carefully as multiple things may need to be updated in order to resolve the query. So if this issue is not resolved, the query response will be rejected and you'll need to make more updates to resolve that query for CPI. There are several resources available with regards to query functionalities, so you can find them all via the link posted here. All right, for the recipient CPI summary reports, these will be automatically sent to the current primary data manager. That primary can elect for other people to also receive communications from CIBMTR by marking them as a CC primary in our system. These reports include information regarding CPI metrics for each requirement. The reports are sent out weekly overnight each Tuesday. The report frequency increases at the end of the trimester nears. Reports are sent out daily the last 2 weeks of each trimester, and then twice a day the last 4 days of the trimester. Then one final report is sent just at midnight at the close of the trimester. So if you have an actual CPI report from your center to review, you can follow along on that, since it might be easier to see and more meaningful than just the screenshot. The top of your report will provide report generated along with the summary of your current status for each metric. You'll see the 5 form completion metrics along with your current percentage and whether or not those values are meeting the target percentage for this trimester. Below that, you'll see the 3 CTA requirements. If you see TBD, that step is not currently due. You can look ahead, of course, but there is no requirement for this trimester for that metric. Finally, you have the IRB status. If you see not applicable, that denotes the center is utilizing the NMDP IRB for their informed consent documents, or the center does not require submission to their local IRB in compliance with the revised common rule. The next table in the output displays indication forms that are due where the due date has not yet passed. The CRIDs listed in the table have been created in FormsNet 3, but do not have a completed indication for the CRID assignment form, the Form 2814. This form must be completed within 30 days of creating the CRID in FormsNet, or it will be counted as late when calculating the CPI metric. Form 2814s that are considered past due are not included in this table, but should still be completed as soon as possible to allow for timely completion of the critical forms that they will trigger. Delayed reporting of this crit assignment form may result in delayed reporting of other critical forms. The intent of this section is to help you focus on the most urgent forms that have the most impact on other forms due. All right, so we're scrolling down a bit to the next table in the output, which displays the rest of the critical forms that are due in the next 2 weeks where the due date has not yet passed. Note that most of the forms will add other forms, some of which will also be critical, so it is important to address these forms ASAP to ensure all critical forms can be completed by the due date. Again, this list is not intended to be comprehensive, but rather to be used as a tool to help you prioritize the most urgent work. The final table in the output represents all the forms due in the previous trimester. This table will have a mix of critical, study, and other forms. So you need to use the form type column to differentiate which metric applies. This table also lists any studies that the patients are enrolled in. This is another tool to help you prioritize your work. Do not conflate it with using the study supplemental form requirement, which is looking at the form type column. A refresh list can be generated at any time using FormSnet. In fact, that's always going to be the best source for finding out what is due. Depending on how actively you are submitting forms, these reports could be outdated before you even open them, so it's important to know how to get to the real-time results. All right, quiz question number 6. Based on your CPI summary reports, which form should you complete immediately and are considered the most critical? A, Form 2006, B, Form 2400, C, Form 2814, or D, Form 2450.
All right, Jenna, our responses have come in, and it looks like that most participants selected C, Form 2814.
Great job, and that was the correct answer. All right, so like I said, a refresh list can be generated anytime using FormSnet, and that's always going to be the best source for finding out what's due. So depending on how actively you are submitting forms, these reports could be outdated before you even open them, so it's important to know how to get to the real-time results. The FormSnet Center Forms Due tool is available for you to generate custom lists for a variety of purposes. You can use it to generate a CPI list or to find all forms completed by a particular user, or even to find the forms that have been audited. Instructions are provided in the FormSnet 3 guide for creating custom lists. We are now going to generate a CPI Forms Due list. We will use the FormSnet training environment, so actual data is not being displayed. I've created 3 lists we are going to be pulling with the criteria and filters to use for each. So for the first lookup, we are going to be looking at the critical forms on time. We'll be using the date type as the form due date, as that's what CPI uses. For the CPI period, we'll be looking at due now. The dates will auto-populate, as we'll be able to see. We'll click search, and then we'll filter the form category to critical. I'm going to open our FormSnet training environment. All right. So again, I just want to reiterate that this is our training environment and actual patient data is not being displayed here. So keep that in mind. All right, so first we'll navigate to our recipient tab. And then under the recipient tab, we're going to go all the way to the right to click this center forms due. Your center populates, and then for the status codes that are populated are all the ones that are considered as a form that is incomplete. So that is forms in due, error, saved, and mod status. As you see, all the other form statuses are unselected. So you want to keep the status codes as they are. We're not going to finagle with any of the forms. We'll do that in the filter criteria below. We'll select US CPI. Again, the date type for CPI is based on form due date, so we're going to leave that alone. We're looking at the critical forms on time, so we're going to click due now. And as you can see, this will populate the start and end date to the current trimester, which starts September 1st and goes to the end of December. And then we're going to click search. Might take a minute or so depending on how many forms are generated. We'll try that again.
And while this information is loading, we did have a question that asks for non-US CPI. In what case would you use that filter or that selection?
For non-US CPI, all of the filters would practically be the same, except this non-US CPI would actually, I believe, auto-populate for non-US centers. And then the start and end date would be modified a bit since their CPI trimesters are different than US trimesters. Does that make sense? So all of the filter criteria would be essentially the same. The form due date you would select and due now. It would just change the start and end date based on the trimester date. I hope that
Wonderful,
answers the question. Yep. All right, so again, just as a refresher, we are looking at the critical forms due now, so the on-time critical form category. So instead of selecting the critical forms within this forms grid, I think it's easier to go to the forms down here, click the ellipses underneath the forms category, select filter is equal to, and select critical. And that will generate a list of all of the critical forms due now for that center, which is shown here. And as we can see for the critical forms, we want to complete these forms before the form due date, which is right here. And if you do complete these, you can see if that completion date was prior to or after the form due date to know if it's considered as counted in your metrics. So the second lookup we're going to do is the critical forms in the previous trimester. So a lot of these filters will be the same. The date type will be form due date. However, the only thing we'll be changing is the CPI period. Now we're going to be changing it to forms due in the previous trimester. Also to note, when you are doing a new search, you need to clear all of your filters or else they will stay there. But since we are actually still looking at critical forms just in different time periods, we'll leave this one on there for now. So for the CPI period, we're going to be looking at due and previous period. And as you can see, the dates changed. So the start date and the end date both changed to the prior trimester, which was trimester 2. And then we'll click search. And then as you can see, all of these are the critical forms that are due within the prior trimester. So for the next search, I'm going to actually remove this filter. So you can do filter clear, which will clear that filter, or you can also click on this button to clear all filters and sort. So for the last search, we're going to be looking at all of their forms due in the previous trimester. So the date type will be form due date. The CPI period will be due in previous trimester. And the dates will also auto-populate. But our filter that we're going to be looking at will be other CPI instead of critical this time. So actually all of the filters are the same. We're just going to click search. And then this time in the form category, we're actually going to be filtering for other CPI instead of critical. So this will show all of the forms due within the previous trimester. This is a really great tool as well because we can export this list to Excel. And this will just pop up in your download. Give that a moment to open. All right, so these are all of the other forms due within the prior trimester. And so this is really great because you can use Excel to do additional analysis or to filter or categorize your data. So if we sort and filter, you can see the data and look at the form due dates as well. One little trick that I've learned if you want to look at the due dates, unfortunately, Excel lists the dates in kind of an ugly format. But to modify this, to make it a little bit more searchable, you highlight the form due date, and then you go to data, select the column, click next, and instead of the general, you'll click on the date and click finish. And this makes it a lot more user-friendly in order to do additional analysis. So now it formats your data in a lot more user-friendly way. So it will change it into a yearly structure and then broken down into the months and the days. So again, this is really nice to do additional analysis if you want to break up the user that is completing the forms or any way that you want to structure your workflow at your center. So I just wanted to point that out. All right, moving along. So again, from your exported data, your center can utilize a lot of different filtering features or even create a pivot table to view metrics and organize the data. So this can help your team prioritize and structure your workload and workflow. And additionally, in our data management guide, we have further instructions to help centers determine their CPI metrics from the Center Forms Dual tool. And we also have included instructions for determining the total number of CPI forms due in a trimester. So this can really assist centers with strategizing, reviewing, or prioritizing how many forms they actually need to complete in a week or month in order to meet the requirements. This can also be used to view the overall trend of form completion and workflow. When you have questions, your first stop should always be the data management guide, as we update this to address frequently asked questions, add clarifying examples, and so on. This will always be your most current and complete resource for all things CPI. If you aren't finding your answer there, your next step should be to submit a ticket to CIBMTR Center support. All right, this next session will describe the process and requirements for our consecutive transplant audit, often abbreviated to CTA. And this is the process that CIBMTR uses to ensure all required transplants are reported to CIBMTR via forms met. So as part of the Stem Cell Therapeutic Outcomes Database, also known as the SCTOD, CIBMTR is required to report to the U.S. government on transplant activity. These data are used to publish activity reports on public websites used by patients, providers, and others within the transplant community. Additionally, complete reporting of HCT ensures the continued epidemiological integrity of the CIBMTR Outcomes Registry. So the CTA requirement has been expanded to cover all transplants reportable to CIBMTR. Because of this, to maintain CPI compliance, all active centers must submit a complete list of all HCTs that were performed at their center each year, as well as resolving any discrepancies between those lists and the data that was reported to FormsNet. CIBMTR has spread the requirements for CTA across 2 trimesters. By the end of the first trimester, you must submit a complete list of your transplants following all instructions for formatting, and I'll get into more on those later. By the end of the second trimester, you must resolve all discrepancies that were identified and address any outstanding queries related to these fields. To ensure that you always have visibility to your current CTA status, these requirements are included in your weekly CPI summary report. You can see each separate requirement listed as well as the current status. So the first step is to register all transplants. So the first thing you'll need to do is ensure that all of your reportable infusions were recorded in FormsNet. Reportable infusions will vary a bit depending on your country's regulations and the reporting level that you've established with the CIBMTR. More details on reporting levels and their requirements are available in the data management guide linked here. If you believe your reporting level needs to be updated, there's a link to the data management guide for instructions on making these updates. So for example, if your country does not allow you to report data to CIBMTR on patients who decline research consent, those would be not considered reportable infusions. In the U.S. centers, they must report all allogeneic infusions. Reporting autologous infusions is voluntary in the U.S., but depending on your reporting level, there still may be a requirement for limited reporting, even for patients who decline consent. Again, more details on the specific requirements are available in the data management guide, or you can reach out to the CIBMTR Center support for further clarification. In order to remain compliant with CPI form submission requirements, transplants should be reported within 30 days of infusion whenever possible. It's best to have a process in place where you are regularly reviewing the infusions that took place and entering them into FormsNet, because catch-up reporting can have a negative impact on other CPI metrics. This process looks at the completeness and accuracy of 4 key attributes: the patient's birth date and sex, the infusion date, and the donor type. The Form 2400 needs to be completed for each infusion in order to have all the data necessary in FormsNet to validate these fields on your CTA list. The second step is to generate a CTA list. So to prepare this list, you need to use your center's records to generate a list with the necessary details. Again, you'll need to make sure your list includes all reportable transplants, including those infusions that are second collection from the same donor, sometimes called a boost. While the clinical intent may not be the same as a full transplant, if the infusion qualifies as a transplant by CIBMTR's definition, it should be included in this list and reported as such in FormsNet. I've linked the forms instruction manual appendix here for reference, and you can use this to determine if an infusion should be reported as an HCT or something else. The DLIs and cell therapies should not be included on this list. Before you submit your list, you'll want to review it for a few things that will cause a delay in processing. The first thing to do is make sure you have a CRID for every transplant. If you do not yet have a CRID, register that and include it on your list before submitting. You'll need to complete the 2814 and the 2400 in order to report all the data needed to verify these transplants. If you've been keeping up with CPI, this shouldn't be too difficult, but ensuring completeness of this list at first submission will reduce the back and forth required to resolve all of your discrepancies in the next step. The other thing you'll want to look at is the formatting. CIBMTR will be running these lists through a matching algorithm, so the values need to match the format exactly or they will be flagged as a discrepancy. The dates need to be in the date format listed with the year first, then month, and then day. The sex needs to be an M or an F, not male or female, and the transplant needs to be allo_U or R or auto, no other variations. Your database may have these fields listed with different labels, so you'll need to update them to the ones specified in order for your list to be processed successfully. If Excel isn't your strong suit and you need some guidance on compiling the list, you can always submit a request to CIBMTR Center support for help. Okay, on to the actual submission. We use CIBMTR Center support for submission because it's secure enough to handle the PHI, and it's got a lot of built-in tracking to ensure we are processing the list and tracking the back and forth if there are any issues with the submission. The system is oriented to customer support, so the prompts are a little awkward for list submission. I've included them all here if you know you are on the right track. You'll navigate the link here, which you should bookmark if you haven't already. Then select Need Help to initiate a ticket. Under What is your question regarding, you can select CTA. Next, under Relating to, you'll see a few options. Note that this is also where you would go to ask the question about the process. You can select CTA HCT list submission and then attach your file to submit the list. Once your list is received, CIBMTR will validate the list and process it. If there are any issues, the ticket will be updated describing what needs to be fixed. If everything is processed correctly, CIBMTR will close the ticket and update the weekly CPI reports to reflect that this step is complete. Step 3 will be to resolve any discrepancies. So the next step is to resolve any differences between the list you just submitted and the data that's actually been reported into FormsNet. If our comparison didn't find any discrepancies between your list and FormsNet, then CIBMTR will update the weekly CPI reports to reflect that this step is complete. Otherwise, CIBMTR will post a file on the CIBMTR portal that lists each discrepancy that must be resolved. You can download the file from there. Detailed instructions for download steps are included in the data management guide and also linked here. The file provided back to you will include all transplants where discrepancy was noted. Some records may have multiple discrepancies, so make sure you are carefully reviewing each record. For each variable provided in your list, there will be 2 columns in your discrepancy file. One that notes what data was provided on your CTA list, and one that notes the data that CIBMTR currently has in FormsNet. You'll need to determine which of them is incorrect and make the necessary updates. If the data reported to form, you'll need to data in FormsNet auto-populate values onto other forms. So if there are other forms completed with incorrect data populated, those will also need to be resubmitted. This is the most common on the 2400, but infusion date updates will impact any other forms that have been submitted. If the data on your submitted list is incorrect, you need to make the update there. Once you have all the updates ready, you can resubmit the list to CIBMTR. This is just another reminder of where the updates will need to be made in FormsNet. There are detailed instructions in the data management guide for each type of discrepancy. If you need help determining what to update or whatnot, you can submit a question via the CIBMTR Center support. All right, for NMDP records of HCT products sent to the sites are compared against the reported HCTs in FormsNet to determine if there are any missing HCT records in FormsNet. Additionally, match source contains the RID, which is a unique recipient ID created by NMDP, and the planned HCT date. These values are compared against the RID, which is reported in the CRID assignment tool, and the HCT date, which is reported on the 2814. The RID must be an exact match. If not, an error will appear in the CTA discrepancy report. HCT dates can be different by a few days, but still considered a match. This is because HCT dates are subject to change at the time they're entered into match source, and it is currently not necessary to go back and update match source dates for CTA purposes. If the RID is not an exact match, the most common fix is to review the RID entered in the CRID assignment tool in FormsNet. This RID may have been entered incorrectly or may be missing altogether. If the RID is entered but the HCT dates are not similar, the first step is to verify the HCT date entered into FormsNet. If the date in FormsNet is correct, inform the Service Center that the date has been verified, and they will ensure this error is not counted against the site for CPI purposes. So once you've made all the updates that are needed in FormsNet and you've corrected your CTA list, you need to resubmit that list to CIBMTR to rerun the discrepancy check. If additional discrepancies are found, CIBMTR will post a new discrepancy list. You'll need to resolve all discrepancies in order to meet this requirement, which may take a few tries, depending on how complex the discrepancies were. The sooner you address these, the better, so that you aren't surprised by additional discrepancies at the last minute. Once all the discrepancies are resolved, CIBMTR will update the CPI reports to reflect that this step is completed. The final step is to resolve all queries. So again, the final step in this process is a verification of the auto-populated fields. CIBMTR will run one last check to make sure all auto-populated fields have also been updated and the necessary validations rerun. If you've successfully reprocessed all of the forms in the earlier steps, this check is unlikely to find any additional issues. CIBMTR will place queries on any forms that require reprocessing. When you enter the form in edit mode, FormsNet will use the auto-population to update the fields in question, so these are usually really easy to address. Depending on the change, this may trigger additional validation that you will need to be addressed, but mostly these will just need to be interact with the query and resubmit the form. If you aren't familiar with the query functionality yet, I've linked the instructions here. Once all queries for this process are resolved, CIBMTR will update your CPI report to indicate that this step is completed. All queries will need to be addressed by the end of trimester 2 in order to meet your CPI requirements. And that's it. At this point, you are done with CTA for the year. All right, quiz question number 7. What CTA requirement needs to be completed in trimester 2? A, submit CTA list to CIBMTR. B, resolve CTA discrepancies. C, resolve CTAs. D, both B and C, or E, all of the above.
All right, Jenna, our answers have come in with most participants selecting B, both B and C.
Wonderful, and D is the correct answer. Great job. All right, quiz question 8. If my center has incorrect data on the CTA list, what do I do for CTA discrepancy resolution? A, update my CTA list with the correct data. B, send back my discrepancy list. C, resubmit my CTA list to center support. D, A and C, or E, B and C.
Our answers have come in with participants selecting B, answers A and C.
And that is correct. The answer is D. So when you guys have any questions, your first stop should always be the data management guide. We update this regularly to address frequently asked questions, add clarifying examples, and so on. So this will always be the most current and complete resource for all things CTA. If you aren't finding your answer there, your next stop should be to submit a ticket to the CIBMTR Center support. All right, quiz question 9. What are the 3 CPI standards? A, form completion, documentation, CTA. B, form completion, CTA, GCSA. C, CTA documentation, CT. D, CTA form completion, CT.
All right, Jenna, our answers have come in with most participants selecting A, form completion, documentation, and CTA.
Great, and that is correct. And that leads us to the end of our session. So thank you guys, and please let me know if you guys have any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jenna. I don't see any questions that have come through in the chat, but of course we will let you know.
Awesome.